Just a very quick introduction. We have with us general education faculty subgroup participants with us today. Gabe Guzman from Science Department, Hunter Steckmeyer from Education, and Michael Henson from CIS. They played a key, all three of them, along with a few other faculty members, played a key role in conduction of general education outcome assessment. This time was global learning. So they're happy to be here to share results and some background information about assessment in general. So I'm not going to take all the thunder away from them. Present to the three faculty members. Please take the thunder away.
Like Zeus would say, I gave you my thunder.
Okay, I'll give you the clicker.
Here's the clicker.
He's going to go first.
Oh, I got it.
We got it?
He's got it already.
Perfect.
Yeah, well, I call this a presentation, but it's more a conversation, actually. And it revolves around assessment, although I know there are different feelings about assessment all over the place. But basically, it's just the way I see it is based on the college's vision and mission. Everything we do here should always revolve around that. Even though the statements are short, when we read them, they really encompass everything that we are trying to do. Whether we are in our discipline, in a very specific class, or something more general. And I think the framework for any kind of assessment should be that. Now, when we're talking about the general education outcomes, we're going outside the specificity of disciplines. We have our own mechanisms to assess in our specific disciplines. And when we talk about the general education outcomes, is in my mind, what do we want our students to be? Is different than what do we want our students to learn how to do. That's very specific to our disciplines. But when they come to this college and they graduate, what do we want them to be? And what do they want to be? So when I look at and reflect on the mission and the vision, for example, when it says valuing the individual, educating and serving the community, it's a very short statement. And we will see that when we talk about the global learning outcome, which is the conversation today, encompasses all of that. And when we read what the vision is all about, it's a community with equitable opportunity for growth. So all the different dimensions that were assessed with the rubric that was developed for this particular global learning outcome reflects all of that. So the mission and the vision, they have changed throughout the years, mostly in length, but on the written, but they encompass the same thing. So I think it's, well, we all think about assessment, and sometimes we think of it as a chore to do. I think if we try to switch our mindsets into, no, this is something that we should be interested to do, because when somebody graduates from this college, they are our best advertisers. So we don't want them to be well-rounded citizens. We want them to be valuable members of their own communities, whatever those communities are. We want them to have a keen sense of what their culture is, and also a sense in cultural sensitivity. So all of that, regardless of what our disciplines are, I think should always be included. And I'm saying this because I always thought that one of the classes that I teach, it really was like a good class to measure or to even assess that, and I was so wrong. I think all our classes are, regardless of how specific they are in a discipline. But again, I have to go through a bit of a shift in my mindset into thinking even this very advanced class in this very specific discipline as something that my students can learn about, for example, global learning, global issues, that kind of literacy. So I think just wanted to provide that kind of framework as we discuss what the highlights are for this assessment.
To add on to that, how each of our curriculum is going to approach each of the gen ed outcomes differently. So obviously you think of quantitative literacy, math is going to have a very strong suit towards quantitative literacy. But in individual compartments, quantitative literacy may not be specific math formulas, but it's still dealing with some kind of numbers and how do you apply those numbers within that. So something that in our department we had a long conversation about was the lesson we did global learning. And how does that really look in the context of our curriculum? Because while overall there are some things that are key components of global literacy, thinking about how does this actually go with what we're teaching versus putting a blanket statement of this is global literacy, which then starts isolating certain programs from being able to use it. So that's something to think about as well from our conversations, is how it may look, may be different. But also, it could apply to a class and it may not apply to a certain class. That's the beauty of the gen ed outcomes, is some of them are for certain classes and some of them are targeted at other classes.
So the exercise is to think about how can I adapt or adopt, or how can I think in a way if I want to assess this particular outcome. So how do I incorporate that into my class, whatever those classes are. So just as a reminder that we have the list over there of the 5 general education outcomes that we have assessed. We're assessing now the last one, global learning. The last one on the list, but it's not really the last one to do, because as we all know, assessment is a cycle, and we're always asking the same question, right? And at the end of that, everything is, okay, so how can I improve and move the needle a little farther? And for that, well, we need a starting point. So for global learning, our starting point was select the dimensions of that outcome to be measured. And when I talk about dimensions, that's actually code language for what a rubric is. So at least all of us have some kind of a roadmap into how are we going to assess the particular dimensions of this outcome. So we have the list over there, from global self-awareness to applying knowledge to contemporary global context. So that as short, phrases, they don't mean much. So we had to come up with a way to help instructors and faculty to implement it, to explain, if you will, which is basically what a rubric is. Explain the different dimensions that are going to be measured, and what kind of marks are we going to get to that. And everybody who's used rubrics knows that we assign points to the different dimensions, right? So that was really the beginning of this work, trying to use some kind of a consensus language in our rubrics to make it understandable. What do we mean by cultural diversity, for example? What do we mean by understanding global systems? And once we were able to define that, then it comes the different stages or the different places where we might be. We haven't done this before, we haven't done this objective before. So expecting that we would be really at the highest point of the rubric, probably not realistic. So I think what I want us to look at when we show you the main highlights of this assessment, the results of it. This is our starting point. This is where our baseline is. And beyond that, there is only improvement. So when we think about questions, when we think about where we are, I think rather than thinking, oh, we are this low or whatever the level we are, okay, this is where we're starting, so we're going to do to move the needle to the next level, to the next part. What do we need to put in place for that? The rubric, I'm going to just show the rubric, but you're going to get a copy of that. I would say it's a very comprehensive rubric, right? And you will have a chance to read what every dimension is all about, but what we're interested is, let's see, it doesn't shoot that far. or close. Oh, I have to be like here.
That way you just got a point. That way you just got a point.
I know.
Yeah.
So what's important is what I mean by levels or where we are. The results are going to show us in which one of these levels are we. So we came up with 4 different levels. The minimum is what we call a benchmark 1, right? So when you see the results, you will see where in here are we. So the optimal, if we can use that word, it will be here, capstone 4, for each one of the dimensions, right? It took us several meetings actually to come up with these, but I think the rubric was well crafted. It was clear enough for anybody and it was understandable enough for anybody, to do those assessments. The other thing that I think we're going to talk about is that since this is the first time the objective is evaluated, we probably were caught a little off guard into, so what kind of artifact can I use, what kind of tool can I use to assess any of these? And some of us may have found out that I don't have absolutely anything that actually I can use to do this. What I have, it doesn't fit these dimensions, which then, of course, shows us that, well, maybe that's the next step, to try to come up with something that we can use, right, to assess these things. So as to not take too much of the time in introductory information, I think we should take a look at what the highlights of this assessment is. And for that, my other 2 colleagues, I'll learn a bit to explain that part. And then I think after that, we're going to move into some kind of discussion and questions that you might have, and maybe next steps that we can think of.
All right. I'll just do it the old-fashioned way if everyone's okay with that. All right, so we've kind of summarized some of the takeaways that we had from the assessment. I don't know if we made this clear, but the assessment that we're talking about was actually done last spring, in spring of this year. So
we're moving on after, well, we're not moving on. We'll come back, but we want to share what we did.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This definitely isn't a one-time thing. It's a cycle, like we said. So this was actually one of our best turnouts as far as getting a good number of artifacts to assess. This is probably the best we've ever had, in terms of the number of submissions. We had 18 faculty participating across 20 course sections, had a total of 289 student evaluations, which, given the size of our school, that's not really a lot, but it's better than we've ever had. So one thing I'd like to take the opportunity to point out is that if any of you can help out with these things, if you have a class that applies to any of these things we're doing, more artifacts are better. More and more minds looking at the artifacts, evaluating them is also better. So we do have a newer way of doing it. I think when we first started doing this a few years back, word kind of got out that the process was kind of challenging, to put it lightly. We've improved a lot the way we've done it. We have better software, better systems, better processes than what we had in the beginning. It's not nearly as painful as it used to be. That's not to say the work is easy, but it's much less monotonous than it used to be. I think it's less of a burden.
We also sorry, I'm going to tag on.
Go ahead, please.
We also shifted from the people who worked on the rubric used to be the people who also evaluated most of the artifacts. And I know my first time being on this committee, I was given math, and I haven't done college level math since I was in college. So I believe this was also the first year where we had the instructors as part of the evaluation of this. So it wasn't just people who didn't know the course content, it was people who knew what they were teaching, what they were looking for. And there was assistance with this as well. It wasn't just, we're handing you a rubric, pick your assignment, and go. There was hand-holding, especially with, I forgot her name. She's unfortunately left us, but she was an integral part of, Jessica, thank you. I wanted to call her Jennifer for some reason, and that was not right. But Jessica was a part of walking people through and talking about, so this is the assignment you picked. How did these specific categories actually apply to you? Which is a lot better than someone who it's asking like quantitative literacy was the first one I did, and it was like asking for a specific number as part of did the student complete it right? And I don't know math formulas. So that was a new thing that we also had integrated.
Yeah. It's funny that it was just a few years ago that we really started seriously looking at general education assessment, and over that time it's evolved so much, you know, for the better. I mean, it's improved, but we've come a long way in a short time, I guess, and I personally think that's kind of encouraging, you know, showing what we can accomplish in such a short span. But anyway, I'm going to show you the data in a moment, but our data shows that we are behind the benchmark that we set. So I kind of want to encourage everyone to look at this from two different perspectives. First is the question of, is the benchmark appropriate for our student population? And then second, are we assessing them fairly and accurately to determine whether we've reached that benchmark? So there's different aspects to this. When I first joined the assessment committee years ago, Lauren, who was our chair at the time, told me that part of assessment is also assessing how we assess. It's not just the students' work, it's our work in coming up with how we assess them in the first place. And that's something else that needs to be assessed. So just kind of want to plant that idea in your minds. So overall, general opinion is that the faculty admitted that their course content did not really have sufficient coverage of global learning, but most of them firmly believed that it should, which again kind of goes back to what I was saying about assessing how we assess. Right? Making sure that we provide those opportunities for students to demonstrate what we want them to demonstrate. And then with faculty input, which is kind of our whole point of being here today, what we're hoping to do is to sort of put together an action plan for improvement for how we can make our benchmark realistic, but also enable students to reach those benchmarks. So here's the bad news. We were aiming for 2. We hit 1.65. Not quite there. And this benchmark and the milestones and the capstones, these are from that rubric that Gabe was just showing. I think you all have a copy of that. So that's what these represent. So we are well past benchmark 1, which is good, but we're not quite to 2. If you want to break down more specifically, here's what the numbers actually look like. Breaking down the different dimensions of global learning and the different levels of measurement. Well, I don't know if this is anything anybody wants to look at or talk about, but this is the hard data right here. So what we really want to do here today is to really just kind of get a conversation going on what are your views of all this? What do you think? We've got some just general guiding questions here, but don't feel like you're limited to just answering these. We kind of want to just get whatever your thoughts are on any of this.
And something, since you guys stole like the thunder, something to think about too is something the three of us have talked about as part of Shelley guiding our conversation on creating today, is that the classes, we're not quite sure like where each of the classes fall. Like, are they introduction classes? Are they advanced classes? Which in the future then we need to think about. So I'm sure that might be a question of like, what classes were assessed? And the answer is I know what class that I had for it, and it was an introduction class, which meant for me that if some of them were able to hit that too, for that class, that was good if some of them could, but that wasn't our benchmark, right? And so it's hard to set a benchmark and then look at which classes we're assessing, because some of those classes, if they're introduction, we're just introducing this topic. We're not expecting them to master it in one semester, versus some classes where my capstone class wasn't selected, but if it had been, that class I would have expected them to be at a 3 or higher. And those are very different courses. So it is something that we're already kind of talking about, is how do we get this data in a way that is meaningful and not just throwing darts out across campus to see which assignment sticks. Does that make sense? So it's already a conversation, but if you have questions about that, I don't have all the answers, but that is something we can also talk about as well. But some of the things that with like our strengths was that there were assessments that had like the 4s. But that being said, we obviously our challenge is that our weakness is that we didn't even hit that 2 across campus. So based on what we've kind of said, what are your initial like reactions or thoughts on what we're doing with general education assessment? And if you didn't know we were doing general education assessment, welcome to the conversation. But yeah, any immediate? What are you thinking?
No, I'm thinking that, the assessment, once the assessment, especially the tool is designed, it's kind of like pull through, right? And the curriculum can follow maybe to make sure that you're teaching something that you're assessing. And I certainly see the need for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Something I see in the results that we have, I mean, I don't necessarily consider that news. I actually consider that is our baseline, because the tools for assessment in different classes, they are very diverse. Like I said, maybe once we read, and we can take any of these dimensions, let's say, we take cultural diversity, we wanted that the majority of our students would actually have a good understanding of that according to what we decided was the milestone 2. And milestone 2 is really explains and connects 2 or more cultures, right? There's a little bit more explanation on that. Probably students can do that, but the tool that we use to assess that is reflective. That could be one. Some of the things to improve. For example, if let's say that it's not an introductory class, or if it's an introductory class in whatever the subject is. If an instructor is actually interested in assessing that part, but doesn't have the proper tool to do it, the proper assessment tool to do it, and the results are really skewed there. If he just says, I'm going to put 1 or 2 questions in an exam, is an exam the best tool, or is a different tool is needed? So I think some things that we could have is a bit of a toolbox where instructors say, I have absolutely no idea how to even assess that. Let me check the list of things that are available, and probably I could incorporate one of these, even though themselves haven't done that yet. Yeah, I don't think we have that.
And that would provide more consistency too.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think we have that that type of resource, or have developed that type of resource, but it could be something that we could have. It's different as an instructor. I said, okay, you need to assess this in your class and then figure it out, right? Or we are assessing this general education outcome, which actually affects everything, right? Now, if you're interested in doing that, here are different ways in which you can do it. And some of them might be just questions, some of them, this is where we have to get creative, right? Kind of help them as well. So they don't have to come up with, how do I even assess this? What can I use in my class? Well, here's a few suggestions. See which one actually fits you, which one you can incorporate. It would make it a lot easier. And I think it would probably help with that mindset shift of people getting some buy-in into doing this. Because it's not really very difficult. And it shouldn't be difficult, it shouldn't take a ton of time, but it's not like a midterm exam or anything. With assessment tools, the simpler they are, the better, and then the more buy-in from people.
So I'm sorry if I missed this, but are these are so you have general education umbrella, and then under general education, aren't there different domains, like different subject matters? And
yes.
Then underneath that is classes, right?
So
So these are all of the, like he was saying earlier, these are the general education outcomes that we have across campus. And whenever curriculum is submitted to the curriculum committee, they have to, I believe, align with at least one of these. Please
Okay.
tell me if I'm crazy, someone. Like, I believe it's at least one. Because in some way, the course should be helping with general education assessment.
Is it the course or the program or?
That's a great question that I have not been here long enough to know the
I'm
answer.
trying to.
I think it's
We have
course
different
level.
levels. Programs have their own learning objectives as well, but those are very specific to one program. And then the course inside that program have their very specific learning objectives. Those are course level. Those are more discipline. Those are more discipline related.
Yeah.
Right.
Each
are
course
institutional.
so each course should have at least one of these. These are the institutional ones. So it doesn't mean that it's going to be like a program level one. For math, for example, you might have a program level of quantitative because it naturally fits with it.
Mhm.
However, all of their classes, for the most part, will fit into quantitative literacy. And I teach early childhood classes. So my classes vary into which general education outcomes they meet. Quantitative literacy is not one that really fits in to any of my classes. And that is okay because that is not something that needs to be as structured within my classes. But in my classes, critical thinking, communication, oral communication, and global learning are actually in all of my classes, but my classes align with all of those. I can't remember your original question, but this is what they all are. In each course, when they submit the course outline, we'll have at least one of these checked off. And if you don't know what your class is aligned to, are you a department chair or ask your department chair what your course is aligned to?
I was about to say, for CIS, we're both CIS.
Okay.
We're like the flip side of yours. I think that when I did all the curriculum updates over the last few years, I think I checked quantitative literacy on just about all of them. Because that makes sense for us, right?
Yeah.
We're always doing, things mathematical, computational, logical design, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So totally flip side of your department.
Yeah, because ours is learning how to care for young children and engage with their families, which means that we have to have strong communication skills. If we cannot communicate with children, you're done. Like, that is the basic what you need to do in my program. So for us, like, it makes sense to have the rest of them. So each one should have it. And the one we assessed last year, like you said, was global learning. This year, we're moving into critical thinking. So as we're getting ready to assess that gen ed outcome, we're trying to think from when we've done it the last couple of years for the other ones, how do we make this an effective assessment cycle for critical thinking? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm just trying to follow the train of thought.
Assessment is a very big and messy train of thought. And I don't mean that at Triton College, I mean in general.
That's the nature of the beast.
That is the nature of assessment.
Well, because I helped with the assessment in CIS.
Yeah.
And I got it drilled in my brain about, you have program level objectives, and then you have course level objectives, and there was a lot of work done to kind of tie them and then to make sure that they can be assessed. And I'm trying to say, wouldn't you want to tie that into that path, or is this goes outside of that?
It should not be outside. The way to see that those are the umbrella above everything we do. Let's say that I teach a class that is very specific. My students are learning how to do this very technique, in microbiology. All right. There is a course level objective that I use to assess if they actually learn to do that. Okay? That needs to fit into the program objective when we're training the students to do a certain number of things. How is that now reflected in the program objective? But when the student graduates from my program, biotechnology, for example, are they capable of critical thinking? Now that ties into the institutional general education objective, because critical thinking is not just in the very thing that they're learning in my program, which is very specific, right? It has nothing to do with childhood education, but critical thinking has to be part of it. How is that reflected now in the institutional general education that we call critical thinking, which is, by the way, why they come here, right? Why people get any kind of education is to acquire a certain level of critical thinking, even though their education may be down to how to code or computers, right? If you talk about communication, I think it's a very global objective, right? Because it doesn't really matter what they're studying here. They need to know how to communicate with somebody else and how to communicate what they are doing. The next one, I think quantitative literacy, that will depend on how deep somebody wants to go. In mathematics is probably a must, right? But even in English, having an idea of quantitative literacy is important. When people want to compare things, when people want to compare qualitatively numbers of people, the amount of money that is spent in healthcare here or there, and they don't have to become accountants for that, right? But they need to have that kind of grasp. And that is, in my opinion, what education gives them. In less than 2 weeks, we're going to engage in that humongously large experiment of electing a president, right? You would think that all of that, for anybody who's pursuing an education, should be central. So they can think, okay, this is how I'm going to vote, and this is what I'm taking into account. This is how I'm evaluating all my choices, right? So I think from the course level, it fits into the next level. And this is the way I see it. From the course level, what my students are doing in my classes, how's that reflected in that big umbrella outcome that we call critical thinking? Are they actually learning how to do it in this little small corner of the college?
Yeah,
You know,
and
when
I think as long as instructors are able to make that jump from the course objective to tie it to something like this, because I'm just thinking about like a CIS class. I don't think the words quantitative literacy is there anywhere in any of those course objectives. So now out of those course objectives, and I'm not saying it should, but what I am saying is out of those course objectives, how does it consistently get tied to that so that your measuring is accurate?
I think that's where the rubrics come into the picture. So regardless of what is it that we're teaching, what the discipline is, what the class is, if there's a room to incorporate some of this, and how do we assess some of this in our classes? That's where I think our weakness, some of our weaknesses are, and something really to be aware of and to think about, right? That I'm very interested in doing this, but I may not have the right assessment tool, and probably I have no idea what assessment tool would look like. So if I can see what other people are doing, how are they using it, or if I can go somewhere where there is several examples, like, oh yeah, I can definitely use this one. I can craft one that suits my class, right? And I can assess this particular benchmark or milestone or something. That's kind of the way I see it.
And one of the challenges to that is figuring out if it is going to be a summative evaluation for the students or if it's going to be embedded in those smaller pieces, which then we get into online classes. They have to submit everything virtually. So you have a ton of data on those things, but if you're teaching those more informed, this is one of our challenges, like I said, is if you're teaching that in class and you're listening for that in the students' responses when they're engaging with you, obviously you don't necessarily have an artifact to then take to assessment. So that's another layer of a challenge for this, is that we might be doing this in our classes and embedding it very strongly in there. So I'll give you an example. The class that I assessed was called Health, Safety, Nutrition. You don't need to know too much about this class, but I was given, the section that was selected was my online section, which meant that I could go through everything and figure out what best aligned. And at the end, I picked one of the discussion boards. And even though it was not a summative assessment, it was more of one of those smaller pieces, it showed me really, really well how students were or were not thinking about global learning. But that is something that if I taught that class in person, I wouldn't have had that artifact because that would have been an in-class discussion. So then that's another layer of a challenge that we have is how do we make artifacts for this while we're embedding it in our courses and making sure that students have this skill. Because for 118, I could have picked, if they selected my in-person one, I could have picked their final assignment, which would have given me that data, but it would have given me like that data where they're trying to get a good grade, where they're trying to please me data. You know those data, like points, where they're like, I want a good grade on this, I'm more worried about that than they were very nervous for that final. It was the easiest final, but that's a different issue. Yeah. That's another thing too, is like how do we get these artifacts? What should they be? And that's a piece of it as well, because I can't go student by student and bring them into this office and go, all right, we're assessing what you know about this. They'd be quite shocked.
I'm struggling, like I can see, okay, I know how in my course to measure those outcomes. In my program, I know how to measure those outcomes, but making that leap, I'm really struggling with how I would measure that.
Well, I think part of the thing too is you don't necessarily have to make an assignment with this rubric. So for example, with my discussion board, this was not any of the things on the rubric. So the discussion board itself was like to communicate something with parents. And they had to, in that case, they have to be aware of parents have different cultures, different values, come from different places. And that is a recognition of diversity and global differences. But nowhere in my actual rubric does it say like, has to be, because again, this is introduction to it, this is introduction to perspective taking. But it's a great thing for me then to see like, okay, how did they, from the online material, get here with their understanding of how to incorporate this? And one of my other instructors had an assignment where she's like, this is the only assignment they've done so far, and they're asking me to have this done by this day. And I was like, all right, we're early childhood, so think about like this assignment does have that perspective taking of how do we be inclusive in education. So let's not measure it based on the rubric you have, let's measure it based on this rubric to see where it fits.
To take the question, maybe if we bring it down to something more like practical, like with an example. So your area is sonography. So it's health is one of the health careers, right? So if we take, for example, this dimension, and we'll talk about global learning. Let's take this dimension, personal and social responsibility, which like that is very vague. What does that mean? Let's talk about the milestone 2, where it says, explains the ethical, social, and environmental consequences of local and national decisions on global systems. Well, the global system may be actually just your area, right? Okay. Everything that has to do with health care is subject to policy. And we don't control policy. We control what happens once the policy is set. Can your students explain the consequences of not, I'm making this up because I'm not an expert in it, but can your students explain the consequences of these policies and now when they graduate as technicians, they will have to follow? What are the social responsibilities? Do they understand the social responsibilities of that?
And if my gut says, yeah, they should, but how do I, like, numerically, how would I prove that? You know what I mean?
Well, now that's like Bob Marley said, those are details, you know. Now now that we identify that, yeah, I think it makes sense. Intuitively, I think it could be done now, how do I do it? And what kind of data do we generate? And at that point, actually, for example, when your students, I don't know the courses in that curriculum. Is there a course, for example, that such things are mentioned? Because that could be the course where you do, sometimes I call these diagnostic assessment at the very beginning of the class, right, just to see baseline. But after the class has ended, after the course has ended, the expectation is that they grasp that part. So can you show me now at the end of the class if you have changed your mind, or how have you evolved your thoughts about this? That's your comparison, actually. Numerically or not, that will depend on how you value how you establish that comparison. So that's one way of doing it. There is a great deal of, I would say, leeway from the instructor to say, oh, yeah, now you can show me that you know, right? Not necessarily with a number. I'm biased in that particular aspect because I don't know who else in the institution does this, but my classes fall under the, I don't know if it's a philosophy practice or what, but it's called grading, so I don't actually grade students with scores or letters. I base on my experience in what I'm teaching, and what they show me that they know, I can detect what they have to improve, and then suggest ways of improvement. If they show me that they have improved, then I can say, okay, now you move the needle. Now you show you understand this part. It's devoid from numbers, actually, right? And I do it on purpose because then, like you were saying, students become very transactional. I'm gonna do this because you're gonna give me this number and this letter, and that's not really the interest. The interest is, oh, okay, I recognize that this is a weakness for me. I don't understand what you mean by social responsibility. So based on your feedback, I'm going to do this again, or I'm going to check these resources, or I'm going to do whatever it is that you tell them that you encourage them to do, right, to improve upon what they know about it, and then they can show you later if they improve or not. Some will still have some work to do. And then that may become the numerical thing. Out of my number of students that went through these, and they all started here, 50% ended here, and 30% has some work to do. Now we're putting numbers into that. I think there are many different ways in which this can be approached, right? But I think it starts with taking each one of these and thinking, yeah, I mean, this is really what they learn in my class, right? Now, how can I show it? How can I document that? Because the truth is, we always do it. We always assess all the time. It's just that we may not document it properly. And this is what assessment is. Just document what we are doing. So we can go back and say, wow, look at that. Last year, we were here. And this year, we kind of moved the needle, or we didn't. Right? In which case, it's always good. Because then the conversation starts. Okay, what did I miss? Or, yeah, maybe I can try something else. So, I think we get too, I like data too, I'm scientist, I like data, but sometimes when we talk about education, we get too hung up on data, on numbers, right? And there are many different ways of achieving a level that doesn't necessarily have to be numbers the way we understand them, like scores, points for a question, correctly answer, or anything like that.
And I remind my students all the time, you're gonna go teach small children. They don't even know what a grade is. Like, that's the thing, it's like assessment, like I have the fortunate position of being able to explain my assessments to my students so that we can translate it into how assessment practices work in education. I have that luxury because that is my content area. But my hope is to make it less transactional for them and be like, hey, the people you work with, like you're work with kids, they grades out of their heads. They do not care if you got an A in a class or if you had a 4.0 GPA. They care that you are able to be with them and to teach them. That is your basis. And that's where assessment gets kind of tricky for us though, is that when it comes to, you have to have a grade to graduate college. And we have to assess you based on what you know. We have to do those things. But the point of it isn't to be punitive, it's to encourage you to continue to grow. Sorry, I like what you said, so I just had to hop on that. And I think students forget that.
There is a difference when we move through the rubric between milestone 2 and 3. Milestone 2 is basically can they explain something. But explaining something doesn't mean they can analyze something. Analysis is a different level. It's easier to think in terms of the
Well,
explanation and the analysis.
Well, even like summarize, explain, teach, analyze. I think that's like very different levels of being able to talk about something. Whereas like you can regurgitate things all day without being able to explain it. You're just saying things and looking at you. I'm like, I don't know if you know what you're saying. 90% of the time that's me because I don't know if I know what I'm saying half the time. But then being able to explain, then be able to apply, like those are whole different levels.
I won't say an easy example, but kind of an example. It has to do with healthcare because in my background is infectious disease control too. So during the pandemic, right, where all these different policies, all these decisions that were made, people could explain the demonstrable benefits, for example, of using a mask, or explain the benefits of vaccination when you have individuals that cannot be vaccinated for whatever reason. How are they protected? So they depend on the protection around them, right? They can explain that, but to analyze the consequence of a global policy of vaccination that affects the workplace, for example, you are not vaccinated, you lose your job. That's very different than those explaining why vaccination is good, right? Can they analyze the consequence of the policy? If to analyze that, have to contrast that with some other thing. So that's why the difference in the milestones are what they are. I think the instructor actually sets the bar. When do you think your students know this? No one else can do that for you. In case of this particular objective. Course level actually is kind of easy, right? Do you know how to use a machine or not? Do you know how to do an ultrasound? Do you know how to do that or not, right? And a very different thing is in the communication part. When you're doing an ultrasound, you discover you see something there, right? Do you tell the patient, oops, right? That is my daughter. Oh no! Yeah, she has stones, and the technician was doing the ultrasound. I understand just very little, but it was very obvious, right? The one thing I don't think tech should do is to tell the patient what they're looking at. And then the person says, "Oh my God, those are some big stones." And then, my daughter is like, she was like 18 years. I thought she was actually scared because of the pain and everything. We're in the emergency room, and then there comes somebody to tell them whatever, right? And then, of course, I tried to come along and said, "Don't worry. I mean, this is not as bad. We know what it is, but the damage is kind of done. She's now thinking surgery. She's thinking she was traveling. She was and then I couldn't help it, and I asked the person, "Did you actually have to say that? I don't think you're supposed to. I think you're supposed to keep the patient calm, and then you discuss this with the physician. The physician, in any case, is the one who needs to break the news, but I think it's you." Okay, that ties into that, right? And you can have a mock type of analysis and see how the students do. And then say, okay, now let's review. You shouldn't have said that this is in a controlled environment, right? There are some things that you need to improve. For example, this is how you approach that. You set the level there, right? And actually, now that I think of it, it's tying into two different things. Your own very specific course level objectives, right? And now that one. Communication is one way to do it. You do it at the beginning when they have absolutely no idea how they are supposed to be, right? And then at the end when they are supposed to know all of these things and have assimilated all these things, do it again and see if you have improved. So,
We only have a few minutes left, and obviously one of the challenges moving forward now is making sure that people have examples of how to navigate this. And obviously some of our successes were like more buy-in from people to submit artifacts. But moving forward after this conversation, what are ways that you think that we could better be a part of the conversation of general education assessment? Or we can be moving forward with this? Even if it's just like finding ways to say what we're doing.
Knowing where we are.
Knowing where we are, like.
See what everybody else.
Which we are at the minimum, really. Benchmark 1 is the minimum.
Yeah, like giving the examples, you just gave me an idea of what I can do in my course now, like the mock situation. So I think it's good to talk with everybody about in the departments, what are you doing to assess it?
Yeah, this was a controversial opinion when I first suggested it, but I still think it's a good idea, so I'm going to say it again.
Yes.
If you have an assessment for your course that assesses something like any of these general education things, I think we should share that with our department, you know? Because chances are that other people teaching either the same, other sections of the same course or related courses.
Do you guys have key assessments in your department?
What?
Key assessments? Assessments that have to be taught in that course?
No, we don't.
That's interesting. That's a different conversation.
But I think that we should, I think we should have something like that, right? Like,
We have key assessments in our department where there are certain things, because we're also aligned to something as well. We're aligned to gateways, and I don't know what your department, like, if you have things you have to meet. But because of our alignment, there are certain benchmarks that students have to meet that are set outside of our institution. So those, our key assessments are tied to those benchmarks. And that's something we have in our department that
our
makes sure
certification
that.
courses probably do, right? Like A+ and Net+, those things probably do. But that's not all of our courses.
Is that alignment? Do any of those align with any of those?
Yeah. Oh, ton of them. That's good. Working in education is wonderful.
Maybe like a repository of all of these things.
Or a visit to like department meetings to explain what you're doing. I wasn't aware this was all going on. So good to be aware. I'm also very new to training, so it just gets started.
But still, like,
And then new assessments going on, but not all of them feedback.
every little piece, still doesn't, I still don't know everything that's happening. I just work here.
On the practical side, I mean, we can come up with, I'm going to use the word repository, of different artifacts that are used in different places. I mean, that would be awesome. I don't know, maybe it could be kept in the CTE as a resource that is related to assessment, you know. And it doesn't matter if there are 200, it doesn't really matter. But, like if I have something that I do with my students precisely for communication, right? I know it's specifically about the class that I teach, but it could be somebody may adopt it or adapt it to what they do. And for me, it really is, when I say communication, is really science communication. And they have to present something to me very early because that's kind of the baseline. And then at the end of the class, they have to present to me again. But I know where they were before, and I know where they are here. That's the discussion. I set the bar where they are supposed to be. They have a rubric, obviously. And then it becomes quantitative because I know how many of the students really meet this part of the rubric, the best part of the rubric, and how many still need work. The only issue that I see is that in my case, I have to do it twice. I cannot use the same assessment tool. I get the results from this group this semester, and then, oh, this is where they are. I'm going to change this and that, and then do it next semester with a completely different group. That I always kind of question that part because the next group is very different. I need to know how they improve this group, and that's why I cannot do it twice. And that means it has to be kind of simple to deploy it. But if I put that in the repository, maybe somebody's going to get an idea. Oh yeah, I can tweak this for my own class, you know. Some will probably, when I look at it, say, no, this I don't actually see myself doing this one. Let's move to the next one. Let's move to the next one. I think something like that could help. Think of it, could help me a lot. Actually, if I see what artifacts other people are using, it gives me some idea. Or I can write out just steal them and use it myself, right? Okay, relocate.
I hope it'll be easier for more faculty to get involved in assessment by doing this. That's kind of my.
Yeah, there has to be a buy-in.
Yeah, and I think that along with discussion in the department would help.
In our department, we decided that, I mean, we're still continuing. I know there is no chair of assessment yet, but the way we approach it in our department is that, well, the day there is one, they're gonna ask for this stuff, so we better have it. So we just continue as is.
Assessment needs to be
Continue
done
doing that.
regardless.
Yeah.
And we all actually do have, in my department, we do have the curiosity actually to see if we're moving the needle. So for my program, I know I have to do it because this is part of my advertisement too.
In our
And a lot of that
department,
data is used for HLC, isn't it?
in our department, every department meeting, I check in with them on assessment, like that is in all of the agendas I write for my department. So one of the things that we'll touch on, even if it's for a couple of seconds, is like, we have our program, we have our courses, how are you guys doing with getting ready for this year's, like, are you working on it yet? Are those classes that are taught in the spring? Like, let's just do a quick check-in. So we're continuing to have that conversation continuously. So that way it might get annoying, and they might be annoyed with me by the time we hit March. But it helps keep that conversation going continuously.
I think all departments at this point should have their plan,
Yeah.
a multi-year plan. Basically, we just decided, well, okay, we're just gonna continue with that plan. We spent a lot of time putting it together. I mean, scheduling when things were going to happen for what classes. Because my department is kind of super large, so it's a lot easier for us to just stay with that plan. Because eventually, all of that is going to be needed. So. We do that.
Great.
If you are more confused right now, then I think our job is done.
Yes. But
Because
if you're-
this is what sparks conversation.
if you're a chair, talk to your dean about like how to structure it for you. If you're not a chair, talk to your chair. Because they are going to be insightful. I hope at least. I don't know everyone. My assumption is everyone's helpful, so.
I actually think it would be beneficial for you guys to have to. Yeah. Because we have so many new people, the teams,
We're doing this again next week, right?
We're doing this again next week.
Wednesday, I think.
but getting people
Yes.
here.
Oh yeah, CT can be a little, no offense, like I don't mean that offense, it's
Because
just
people
like.
are but if they're already all together in a room,
That would matter, yeah.
When are your meetings, your department?
the